Oh,
We
okay.
are live.
Woohoo. Okay, so I am going to talk about this article that I, it is introductory. Considers itself a primer. Um, and I'm really going to focus on the theoretical side of it, less than the very, especially quantitative, statistical application side, because I don't fully understand that. Um, and I have to admit that many parts of this I don't understand myself deeply either. However, I still think it will be helpful um, to refer to this article and to uh, kind of go through these steps that it lays out very neatly for scale development and validation. Uh, Keeping in mind that it's really talking about developing new scales more so than what a lot of us do, which is like adapt and do validation of other scales. There are some things that are going to be relevant across the board, but especially some of the beginning parts are going to be when you're kind of starting from scratch. So you'll see, let's get into it in just a moment when I share my screen. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Okay, good. You guys can see.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the paper. I put the link in the chat. You guys obviously can also look it up. Um, as I said, it's a primer for developing and validating scales with a particular lens towards what we do, which is health, social, and behavioral research. So first of all, we have to understand a little bit about why we use scales, what are latent constructs. So scales exist because latent constructs exist. And what latent constructs are phenomena, behaviors, attitudes, hypotheticals um, that exist as a result of our theoretical understanding of the world, but we cannot directly assess or measure them. So there are lots of variables that we can measure very directly. We can measure someone's height directly, but we can't measure their thoughts directly. We can't observe all of their behavior. We can't understand someone's knowledge on a topic directly. We have to have some kind of measure that assesses that somewhat indirectly. So scales are how we measure those things, capturing a behavior, a feeling, or an action that can't be captured in a single variable or item. So to note that a latent construct doesn't necessarily need a scale to measure it, but scales are going to have multiple individual variables or multiple items to summarize this construct that we're measuring. And when we use multiple items to measure that underlying thing, the construct, the variable, it can also account for measurement error that's maybe specific to particular items. So if we have a scale, but even one of the items doesn't perform very well on its own, it's going to sort of wash some of that out, allowing us to measure things better. And of course, why does this measurement matter anyways? It says it's going to give us more accurate research findings, but what that's getting at is often these latent constructs are they are our outcomes. They might be behaviors that we're targeting in an intervention. They might be psychological outcomes and things like that. So let's take a look at one example. This is the PHQ-9. Some of you know it very well. This is the English version. We use it in a lot of our research in various languages, and I know that some of you that have worked clinically are quite familiar with this, or some of you that have been patients may be quite familiar with this from your own lives. So it has 9 items, which is indicated by the name. Patient health questionnaire. A side note is that this article doesn't talk about how to name your questionnaires or your scales, but like patient health questionnaire seems like the dumbest possible name you could come up with for something that's supposed to be measuring depression particularly, but that's just my opinion. Okay, sorry to editorialize. So, let me see, I need to hide this little thing so I can see better. So it asks, over the last 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by any of these problems? And the person is supposed to, it says check, but you could check or circle or whatever, which of the things the participant endorses. So you can see, like, if you only had one of these items or 2 of these items, you wouldn't really be measuring depression, but maybe something else. But when we put these things together, we notice that this phenomenon is a good indicator that someone is potentially suffering from depression. So that's an example of a scale, okay? And a latent variable for that matter. There's not really I don't want to say there's not a better way to measure depression because that's not exactly, it's not exactly right, but it's a convenient way to measure something that we can't directly observe. Okay, ooh, for some reason, oh, there it goes. So this paper lays out 3 phases and 9 steps of scale development and validation. This is one big long figure in the paper, but I cut it up so you can see it better. We're gonna go through each of the three phases and 9 steps in some detail. Some of them are a bit more straightforward than others, so I'll spend more time on some of them as we go along. Okay, so first of all, there's phase 1, the item development. So the first thing that we have to do is really step back and ask ourselves, what is it that we're trying to, what is the domain of what we're talking about? What is part of this phenomenon and what is not part of this phenomenon? Of course, we kind of have to look and see if there are existing instruments. Otherwise, we don't need to be reinventing the wheel. And then, you know, have a conceptual definition of the phenomenon. At this point, if there are if there's some dimensionality of the domain, some things are really only going to have kind of like one dimension, but there are other more complex constructs that might be multidimensional, and we should specify those in the beginning and define them individually. And then comes item generation, excuse me, which can be done through deductive methods or inductive methods. Deductive methods is going to kind of be like looking at what's already out in the world and related. And then inductive methods is going to be kind of doing some exploratory, qualitative data collection to figure out what items would describe the phenomenon that we're getting at and the individual dimensions if they are out there. Ideally, we would combine both deductive and inductive methods. And there are a lot of kind of rules of thumb in this world. That the thing we know with rules of thumb is that they're, you know, they're rough estimates. They're not strict. And sometimes they don't always serve us. But the authors here suggest that you should really be trying to generate items in this phase that are way more than you actually want to use in your final scale. So their suggestion is that you have about double the items that you're going to end up wanting in the end. Sorry, I'm going to change the way my screen looks for a second so that I can see my notes because I have some notes in the next slides. Just a minute, sorry. I'm going to see if this will work. Okay. and you'll have to let me know. Oh, something. Okay, let's try this. Are you guys are seeing the slide? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Okay, so here we are. Let's see. Some people have even like recommended that the initial pool of item be as many as like 5 times as long as the final version. But as I said, these authors suggest that probably double is sufficient. All right, a few notes on item development. Of course, we need to consider the form of the items, the wording, and importantly, the types of responses. Keeping in mind that we're trying to capture the lived experience of that phenomenon by the target population. So, you know, of course, sometimes we tend to kind of take our own perspective a little too much and not be considering the target population, which is obviously a mistake. Things should be simple and unambiguous. There shouldn't be double-barreled questions where there might be 2 different answers to the same question. And of course, we don't want to be offensive or potentially biased in terms of social identity or for that matter in any way. The authors reference 5 essential characteristics of items to be considering. That's consistently understandable, consistently administered or communicated, including the consistent communication of what constitutes an adequate answer. It's important. The participants have to have access to whatever they need to answer the question accurately. And then, of course, the participants have to be willing to provide the correct answers. And that kind of gets to things like overly long and burdensome questions, very like offensive or probing questions. One thing I'm not going to talk about too much here, but is important and often neglected is like the order of the items. If we start with the most personal items, then we're probably not going to get as good of as accurate of a response than if we have the survey or the scale designed in a way that gets into more intimate details after we've built a little rapport. Okay. All right, and then for the number of points on a response scale, again, we have a rule of thumb, but these are not always what's used, and they're not exactly, you know, perfect. But the advice that the authors give here is 5 points or 7 points, depending on whether something is unipolar or bipolar. Unipolar being like a degree in one direction, so either you're not at all satisfied, or you're very satisfied, or you kind of have a middle, which is kind of neutral, and then 2 poles, in which case they recommend 7 items, or 7 response options. That's not the same as the number of items. And then you would go to step 2. So step 2 is about content validity, and content validity is about the process of ensuring that only the construct that you've defined conceptually and not other things that might be related but are outside of our intention are part of the scale. So there's 2 parts of this: evaluation by experts and evaluation by the target population. Sometimes both of these aren't done, but ideally we would have both. For evaluation by experts, as is noted here, those experts should be totally independent of the people who developed the item pool. Hopefully it's obvious why, but we don't want to have any bias in the assessment there. So we want experts to evaluate the items, each item, to see if they're relevant, if they are representative, if they're high quality, and there are different ways to measure this that I'm not going to get into. And then we want our target population to evaluate it, each item, to see if it's relevant to their experience. If they say, okay, this doesn't really have to do with what you said you're measuring. That's not exactly what we're talking about. And this can be done through cognitive interviewing, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a minute. And that's to evaluate what's called face validity. Face validity kind of being on its face, so to speak, like just by looking, does this seem to assess what we think we're assessing? So as I said, the cognitive interviewing is also part of pre-testing, which is what they have in step 3. Pre-testing the questions to make sure that the questions and the answers choices are meaningful. And this should be in the target population before the survey is actually administered. This is going to help us reduce misunderstanding, obviously, and then measurement error that would be related to that in the future. And it should eliminate items that are poorly worded, and help us revise the phrasing to be understood as best as possible. It also should reduce the cognitive burden on research participants, which is always something that we should be keeping in mind. And it's really important to remember that there are these 2 parts. The first part being how much do the questions reflect the domain we're studying, and then the second being looking at the extent to which the answers possible to the questions produce good measurements. It could be done on a sample outside of the study population or like a subset of your study participants, but it definitely needs to be done before you finalize your questionnaire. And this is a pretty cool process where you just go through and you kind of get inside of the person's brain and have them read each item and say, okay, how do you understand what this to mean? And how do you think through how you're going to answer it in detail? They say that 5 to 15 interviews in 2 or 3 rounds, or until you kind of get saturation, meaning no new information is coming up, is going to be the best for this pre-testing. I think I could make a whole job out of doing cognitive interviewing, and it would be very fun. So yeah. Next up is step 4, survey administration. So we're going to collect data. We're going to try to minimize measurement error. And we want to use a sample that's going to reflect the target population. The paper talks a fair amount about using pen and paper or using technology. Every method of collecting the survey data is going to have drawbacks, and I'm not really going to get into those here. Establishing a sample size, I know, is something that a lot of us are very curious about. Again, there are rules of thumb on this, but you could spend hours and hours and hours, days and months reading about some of the statistical philosophy and or arguments. I should have said the theory behind what some of these folks recommend. There's really not one answer to an ideal sample size. You're always going to do better with more, but the conclusion that the authors come to here as a rule of thumb is that you want 10 respondents for each survey item, or maybe 200 to 300 observations. Again, it's a rule of thumb. Depending on your scale, you may need more or less. And then the type of data to use, to fully test for reliability, you either need an independent data set or a subsequent time point. So that's important to note if you really want to establish validity. you kind of need to establish reliability, which is going to require one of those things, either an independent data set or a subsequent time point. Maybe you even would like both. All right, and then coming to item reduction, this is really interesting. This is where you really get into a lot of statistical analysis, which again, I'm going to try to focus on the theoretical and not get into the details, but you can see that the paper does make some recommendations on these. And I'm going to go into detail on what these different activities are. So don't worry too much. This table that I keep going through on each slide is in the paper, but I'm going to go through. I just want to note there's two theoretical bases for scale development that are referenced here. CTT is classical test theory, and IRT is item response theory. CTT is like the more traditional thing, and IRT is more modern. They both are meant to help like assess latent constructs, and we could use them independently or together to complement their strengths. And either way, the goal is to determine the items that we want to keep and kind of look at the dimensionality and improve our development of scales. And then within those theories, there are a lot of different techniques depending on what's driving the scale development. But the 5 major ones are shown here. And I said I'll go into detail on those, and in addition to something about deleting or imputing missing cases altogether. So let's look at these individually, starting with item difficulty index. This is also called easiness. This comes from educational and psychological testing. So it doesn't, you might not find it very relevant to some particular types of measurement because you're generally going to expect like a correct answer like you would on a math test. So it's meant to assess relative difficulties and discrimination abilities of test items. Discrimination being like how accurate it can rightly predict the right answer or the incorrect answer. There are plenty of types of, there's many types of research or, measures that we would expect to have a correct response. A math test, like I said, a health literacy scale where there's like one right answer and other wrong answers. But there's other things that might not have a correct response, like some opinion surveys or things like that. We don't expect a correct response, so this might not be the right approach for us to use. However, in CTT, we would look at the proportion of correct answers on a given item, and that's that, right? So if it's higher difficulty, keeping in mind that we're also calling it easiness because it's a little bit contradictory. So we'll call it easiness. Higher easiness means a greater proportion answered it correctly. It's easy to answer. And then lower easiness or difficulty scores mean a smaller people understood the question and answered correctly. There's a lot of reasons that could be. Perhaps it's coded wrongly, it's ambiguous or confusing, the response options aren't clearly distinct. One problem we have sometimes with response options is they're not mutually exclusive. That's very problematic because the participant doesn't know which option to choose. And then in IRT, they look at difficulty as the probability of a particular examinee to correctly answer any given item. So again, we're looking at this on an item by item basis. And whether you need low, medium, or high difficulty kind of depends on your purpose. In some cases, like if you were a teacher, I think you would want a variety of items so you could see some more variation in your sample that would really tell you the knowledge, whatever, of your students, as it were. You generally want things to be kind of in the middle of item difficulty, but again, there could be other reasons you want something different. Item discrimination index, this is pretty interesting. again, this is another thing that teachers look at a lot. So what we're looking at here, but this doesn't have to be where there's a so-called right answer. So it's also called item effectiveness test. In other words, how effective does this item differentiate the performance between different groups? So the way that you would look at this is looking at kind of an upper group, which might be like the top 20, the 25th top percentile and the 25th lower percentile, so on the score of the whole scale. So if we have people who are taking that depression scale and we take the bottom 25% who are likely not to have depression, and then we take the top 25% who have really high scores for depression, and then how many of them endorse the questions effectively in a way that discriminates, is what you would want. So it's calculated by the percent of participants in the upper group that get the answer correct, which may not be the right term to use, minus the percent of participants in the lower group that are correct. So what this gives us is items. It tells us if the item is positively, negatively, or non-discriminating. Positively discriminating is kind of probably the first thing that you would think about, is saying, okay, on my math test, only the people who are in the top group got this question right, and none of the people in the lower group got it right. So it effectively tells me this item discriminates well between high test scores and low test scores. There are also confusingly sometimes negatively discriminating items, which kind of do the opposite, where the people who are more knowledgeable get them wrong and less knowledgeable get them right. That could be rather confusing. So that could happen if you have like a bad happiness scale that's just crappy, and you take people who are like medically diagnosed with depression and those who are not diagnosed with depression, and for some reason the ones who are diagnosed with depression are scoring higher than the ones who are not. So something unexpected there. And then for those, and then you might have non-discriminating items where there doesn't seem to be a difference in the people who you expect who have a high score in total or a low score in total. So if it's completely non-discriminating, that kind of means your item is useless. So those ones are good candidates to remove. And then negatively discriminating items probably need a closer look, might need to be removed. Sometimes we just had those coded wrongly. So it looks like it's not quite right, but really we've just coded it wrongly, or maybe our response options are not good. And then positively discriminating items, of course, is kind of what we're going for, and we want to keep those items. And yeah, this could be presented with correlation analysis between the performance of an item and an overall criterion. So like I said, if we were looking at the depressed folks and then the non-depressed folks, maybe the overall criterion would be like the DSM diagnosis of depression. That would be our criterion that we say, okay, depressed people, not depressed people, where are they on this happiness scale? Does it differentiate well? This is also used in like education, as you might imagine. I can only guess that like test creators in education are like spending a lot of time looking at this. All right, then there's inter-item and item total correlation. This is often shown in a matrix because it's a bunch of correlations, and it examines the relationships between the individual items in a pool. And when I read items in a pool, I had to put a picture of items in a pool. Nothing, no response. I thought it was funny. It's okay. Inter-item correlations are going to be how much the scores on one item relates to scores on other items. So that tells us if the items in the scale are assessing the same content. we expect that the items will be related. And then item total correlations would be each item versus the total score. And even better than item total correlations is adjusted item total correlations. Because if we want to take out the item that we're looking at that point, because it's just kind of adding fluff to the item total correlation assessment. So we would look at how does that item and the sum score, except for that item, correlate. So we're looking at that. And of course, if they're low correlation, it seems like we're getting off track and getting into something that isn't quite so relevant to our item or to our scale as a whole. And then there's distractor efficiency analysis. Again, this is more of an education thing. We rarely use this in health sciences, although there are some relevant things, like maybe if you're looking at like health literacy. So this is often like, this is for multiple choice items. And again, we often use like Likert type things. So we're not really looking at those types of multiple choice items. But again, going back to your math test or your language arts test in particular is a good example. We have a correct answer and then we have incorrect response options, which are called distractors. And those are meant to attract students who don't know the correct answer to choose them. And so those are intentionally added in. And you can calculate for each item whether the distractors are efficient or not. So the way you do that is kind of like the last one, a little bit different. So you can take the groups into thirds and based on their total score. So we have our high scoring English test people, our middle scoring English test people, and our low scoring English test people. And we look at how often each group chooses the correct response. And we want the high group to choose the correct response almost all the time. We want the middle group to choose sometimes, and we expect that very few in the lower group choose the correct option. This is kind of related to the discrimination, but it's specific to the distractors. And so if our distractors are not really functioning, if no one is ever choosing them, or if everyone is always choosing them, they're not good distractors. They either may be too similar to the correct answer, or like the answers aren't different enough, or they're just so outlandish that no one is picking them. You have to wonder how those evil teachers come up with good distractors that frustrate test takers. All right, and then lastly, there's missing cases. I'm not going to go into detail on this. Maybe Jean-Victor will tell us as he's getting enlightened on missing cases. But there are two different methods that they point out here for dealing with missing data in scale development. There's a lot of ways to deal with missing cases in general. There are a lot of approaches to dealing with missing data in scale development. But the two that they mention here that are the most useful for addressing missing data in scale development are full information maximum likelihood and multiple imputation. A note that they point out is that when using multiple imputation for missing data in the context of survey research, we prefer item level imputation rather than scale level imputation. If that means nothing to you, I'm sorry, because it hardly means anything to me. But we'll turn to our more advanced psychometricians to answer questions on that. And researchers will also just opt to delete items that have large numbers of missing when we can't do other things. So there's often rules of thumb too on like what threshold is it okay to use imputation or other missing data approaches. Like, okay, if the person answered 50% of the scale or 75% of the scale. So if you're doing kind of imputation, it's a good idea to kind of look in the literature and see what's the norm or kind of accepted threshold, if any. But again, I can't really go into too much detail on that. So all of those things I just mentioned are going to help us kind of throw out items, which is why in the beginning we wanted to start with so many items so that we're at liberty to throw out the ones that we think are not going to work for us. And then last is step 6, extraction of factors. Again, I'm going to talk about this only sort of theoretically, but you could take a whole course or more in this activity. So factor extraction is where we have all of our items determined, and what we're trying to assess is the optimal, ideal number of factors or domains in the scale. And this is done using factor analysis, which uses regression modeling, where we take observed or measured standard variables and our latent factors, and basically the outcomes of that regression analysis are correlations, representing how much each variable loads on a factor. So the idea here is to understand the internal latent, meaning not directly observed, structure of the set of items, and the relationship between them, between the items, and see how consistent those are internally. And again, there are various analytical approaches to that, to determine the number of factors from a list of items. And again, some of those are listed here on the right side, but I'm not going to go over them for the sake of time. And the extraction of factors can also be used to reduce items as well. So there may be items with factor loadings or slope coefficients that are under 30% or 0.3, and those are often considered inadequate because they don't really contribute much of the variability in the construct. So often it's recommended to keep items that only have factor loadings over 40%. Yeah. Almost there, step 7. I'll say a number of scales that have been developed stop at that factor extraction phase and jump on to tests of reliability and other things. But the factors extracted in that last step only provide a hypothetical structure of the scale. We don't really have evidence of it. So we have to look at the dimensionality of those factors in this step 7, and then go on to reliability and validity, which are in the next 2 steps. So dimensionality, a test of dimensionality is looking at which of those hypothesized factors or that factor structure extracted in that previous model if they're going to perform the same way on either a different sample, ideally, or a different time point in a longitudinal study. So those tests of dimensionality that are mentioned here are going to determine whether the measurement of these items or their factors are going to function the same across these 2 different samples or time points. So this can be done with independent cluster modeling, confirmatory factor analysis, bi-factor modeling, measurement and variance, blah, 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 beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. And then for the second activity in this evaluation is scoring final items. So for the test of dimensionality, these final items can be used to create scale scores. So often our scales are just a sum of items, but we can also use weighted procedures where the weight, the loading of those factors, back to use factors as a verb, it goes into the calculation of the score. So if some of the items or the factors are kind of weightier, heavier, more important than others, we'll weight them differently when we scale when we score the scale. Oh, English is hard. Okay, moving on then. There are, about dimensionality, again, I cannot cover all of this for more reasons than one, but this is table 2 from the paper, which has a description of the model fit indices, and very usefully, it has recommended thresholds. So if you guys are doing this work, I would refer back to this paper if you kind of want to get a summary of what are the sort of rules of thumb for thresholds. And of course, it has references to specific papers if you guys wanted to read more about that, because it is a little complicated for those of us that are new to this area. Okay, and then almost to the end, step 8 is about reliability. So reliability is the degree of consistency when a measurement is repeated. It's a constituent part of validity, but something could be reliable but not valid. We always keep that in mind. So there is a number of standard statistics to assess reliability, including the ones that are referenced on this table. And of these, the authors note that Cronbach's alpha and test-retest reliability are predominantly used to assess reliability in scale development. And just briefly, Cronbach's alpha is used to assess the internal consistency of the scale items, how much the items vary together relative to the sum score. And there are some recommended thresholds for that. You want a high coefficient for an internally consistent and reliable scale. There are other reliability statistics that are becoming more common and accepted other than Cronbach's alpha, but that's kind of our old faithful. And then for test-retest reliability, which is also called the coefficient of stability, this is used to assess the degree to which the participant's performance is repeatable. So how consistent their scores are in sum over time. There's different ways to measure this. Some people use the interclass correlation or Pearson product moment. And in both cases, the higher the correlation, the higher the reliability for test-retest. If you're closer to 0, it's not reliable. Of course, there are some constructs and some study conditions where test-retest reliability is going to be low. It kind of is part of the study. So if you're doing an intervention study, you may have for your outcome lower test-retest reliability because you're actually you're hoping to change the response to those items. All right, and lastly, some of the more fun things are these tests of validity. So it's interesting because this talk is supposed to be about scale development and validation, but we're kind of just getting into these tests of validity. I'll note that we did talk about content validity early on, but here we're getting into those actual like statistical assessments of validity. So first of all, under what's called criterion validity, we have 2 flavors of that, predictive and concurrent. So in general, criterion validity is the degree to which the relationship between our scale score and performance on another measure that's particularly relevant, which is called criterion. So this is kind of when we look at those like gold standard measurements often. So again, there's 2 types. Predictive validity is looking at how much our measure predicts answers to some other question or results in the future that it should be related to. So it's predicting things that are going to happen in the future. So an example of that would be a standardized test score. An SAT score should predict the student's first year grades in college. Okay, those things aren't the same, but we expect that if they are scoring higher on the SAT, they're going to score higher in their college courses. Similarly, an example given in the paper was that there's a breastfeeding social support scale. And of course, the hypothesis is that if the mother's receive social support, they're going to have a higher willingness to exclusively breastfeed, and it will predict that behavior down the line. Related, but a little different, is concurrent criterion validity. And that's how much these scores have a strong relationship with some gold standard measurement at the same time of the test administration. So this is that gold standard thing. So an example that we use on this one is we have looked at the audit scale, which is the alcohol use disorder identification test. And how does that correlate with the DSM criteria for alcohol use disorder? The DSM being the gold standard for diagnosis, how does our screening tool line up with the diagnostic manual? One limitation that we have a lot in our kind of behavioral research is that this concurrent criterion validity doesn't work for some of our variables because they just don't exist. So that's why a lot of times you don't see this kind of work. So for example, alcohol consumption doesn't really have a gold standard. There are like kind of better practices to use, but unless we're like measuring somebody's blood like every day, we're not really going to know truly a gold standard measurement to compare it to. So some studies just won't have that piece. I'm going to try to go through these quickly, but these are kind of what I find the more interesting pieces because I know we're out of time. So the next type of test validity are regarding construct validity. And that's getting at, does this instrument assess the construct that we're trying to measure and not other things in the real world? So these are 4 of those ways to get at construct validity, but there are many others. Convergent validity is looking at how much the scores on our instrument are related to other similar constructs or other similar instruments. So for example, like it says here, the same construct measured in different ways. So if I do well on a Swahili vocabulary test from this teacher, I'm expected to do well on a Swahili vocabulary test given by another teacher. That's convergent validity. Discriminant validity is looking at the extent to which a measure is novel and not measuring some other construct. Be careful with discriminant validity because some people think of this as the opposite, but that's not exactly right because 2 things that are opposite should correlate. If I measure high on a happiness scale, I'm going to measure low on a sadness scale. It's a stupid example. So those things actually do correlate. But what I want to know is that this doesn't really correlate with anything that's not what I'm trying to measure. So as an example, you could measure at the same time depression scale and an introversion scale. Those things should vary independently if they're truly measuring discriminant or different things. Another tool that you often see thrown out about discriminant validity is measures of social desirability. When we have things that are stigmatized or that our participants for one reason or another are unwilling to report, if we can also put a scale on social desirability, we can see, okay, if these 2 things correlate too much, if our new scale correlates too much with social desirability, what we actually might be measuring is social desirability, not stigma, or something like that. And then known groups, differentiation or comparison between known groups is looking at how do groups score. So we'd have like a binary item. That might be, for example, is one study was looking at a mobility scale. How easy can people get around and move their bodies? And the binary item it compared it with was people who use assisted devices like canes or walkers and people who didn't use assisted devices. We expect that those 2 groups are going to consistently score differently. And then to be perfectly honest, correlational analysis is here, but the authors kind of contradicted themselves and said, actually, it's not the best practice. You should use linear regression. And frankly, I don't understand what they mean. So I'm not going to cover this one too much. And we're out of time anyways. So that is the paper. I hope that you guys can take a look at it. And as I said, I think this is a good one to keep in your references. I'll go back to the beginning so you can have that link, but I'll see if I can answer any questions. Not very confident, but that was a whirlwind primer on the primer. What questions do people have?
This was great, Ashley. My question is, how do you plan to use all of this knowledge in your PhD? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I mean, not in theory. I'm not really sure. So still trying to develop the final plan, but I hope to do, because what we'll probably do, if anything, is sort of the assessment of measures that already exist. We'll be looking a little further, but kind of in different populations. We'll probably be looking a little further down the line, not so much like item generation and content validity, but factor extraction, like confirmatory factor analysis, and those tests of validity to see if these measures are adequate, is what I hope to look at, but time will tell. I would love to, I didn't have the opportunity, but if folks want to learn more about this, what I think would be useful, what I hope to do is kind of go through some of the citations in this paper, because they're citing kind of some of the seminal like textbooks in psychometrics and things like that, and trying to summarize what's like a whole PhD worth of information into a handful of pages and basically like 2 tables. So they did all right for that. There were some things that they lost me on.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? I know it's kind of boring, a little dense, but using these things is fun.
Not boring. It's dense, right?
I think sometimes we, and this happens, when you prepare papers, and it certainly happens with folks that I went to my master's program with. Like, we get a little bit caught up on like, oh, what's the difference between convergent validity and there was another one that's kind of like convergent validity, but whatever. These different like semantics, and frankly, it doesn't really matter outside of the context of a research methods course exam, like because we're going to, some of our reviewers, and we want to make sure we're using the right terminology, but these are all kind of getting at the end at the same thing of validation. Are we measuring what we say we're measuring? Something we might look at in the future in one of these groups that is really interesting and often neglected is, I can't remember the term for it, but it's like the validation of, it's kind of like content validation for interventions. Because we often think about validation in terms of outcomes, dependent variables, but we don't often think about it in terms of independent variables in intervention studies. Which is really interesting because there's a lot of threats to validity for intervention studies, biases basically, on how things are assessed, on how things are administered. And often we focus a lot of our time thinking about validation in terms of outcomes, but there's a lot of, internal validity is really about the intervention, not so much about, it's also about measurement, but it's about what we're doing as interventionists and researchers, not only the measures themselves. We spend a lot of time on that in behavioral in my health behavior past. Thanks, Timothy. Hopefully I can learn more and share that as well. Just the beginning. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I'm sorry that we're out of time, but hope everybody has a great Tuesday.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank
presenting.
you.